Hi, my name is Zack. Let me tell you a story. The year is 2017. I graduated with my bachelor's in political science from SUNY Brockport about a year before. I then spent 3 months working on a competitive congressional campaign that had me working 16-hour days, 7 days a week. We lost, so, that was a fruitful and productive use of my time. I was adrift, literally living in my mom's basement and working part-time. I spent several hours a day throwing my resume into the void. I had an interview here or there, but nothing that led anywhere. Until one day, I found a listing from somewhere called Families Together in New York State, a nonprofit with headquarters near where I lived in Albany. They were looking for someone to lead a new educational initiative for young adults with developmental disabilities. I was suspicious of this listing because it seemed too perfect. It was nearby, my professional experience matched, and it was a solid starting salary. The linchpin was that they were asking for someone with lived experience, a term I had never heard before. The ideal candidate was someone with a developmental disability diagnosis. At the end of the listing was another phrase I had never heard before. Nothing about us without us. Now, I'm on the autism spectrum, something that anyone who has spent more than 30 seconds talking with me could tell you. Not only was this something that did not come up during the usual job interview, it was often a hindrance. I could be an exceptional candidate, only to bomb an interview because of a social faux pas. I parked in their far too small parking lot, gazing up at the quaint 2-story brick building covered in grapevines. I entered and went upstairs to interview with a small team. This was unlike any job interview I ever had. We talked about my professional experience, sure, but we also discussed my autism, what it was like navigating that in a workplace, how it would affect my perspective on this initiative they were developing. Some of them even shared that they were on the spectrum as well. For the first time, in a setting like this, I was around peers. Welcome to the Peercast. So, why is this? What is this? Is this another instance of the apparent obligation of a white man to make a podcast? My answer to that is something can be more than one thing at once, and also shut up. I'm Zack Kilmer, and I'm the peer narrative and multimedia specialist here at Families Together. I'm basically our in-house content creator. I make silly little videos, silly longer videos, and now this podcast apparently, to tell you about all of the important work we do here. So, enough preamble. Let's answer the question I have been asked repeatedly by the same relatives at almost every family gathering I've attended for the last 8 years. Who is Families Together in New York State, and what do we do? We are a statewide nonprofit that seeks to amplify the voice of New York's families and young people. We advocate for systems, policy, and cultural change that will create a more equitable state that better serves its citizens. Part of the difficulty of answering the question of what do we do is that the short answer is a lot. Many nonprofits are a one-trick pony that focus on one topic area, something I'm jealous of at times. Feeding America, for instance. No question about what they're trying to do, it's in the name. The easiest way I can break down Families Together's focus is what I call the Big Six: mental health, addiction, child welfare, juvenile justice, education, and developmental disabilities. Now, that's a huge list. There's also an immense level of overlap between those topics, but that's the easiest way I can lay it all out. Our specific policy stances are going to come up both later in this episode and more in-depth in future episodes. The short answer I can give is we are fighting for these systems to better aid and improve the lives of New Yorkers than they are now, which is often suboptimal or outright failing. We also advocate for more peer support in essentially every level of these processes and systems. If you want some more immediate answers, I recommend giving us the old Google and finding our website. We have our policy agenda and some specific stances that our policy department would always love to have more eyeballs on. So, that's the what. What about the how? How are you trying to make these changes? I'm so glad you asked. You are full of convenient questions. The first avenue is legislative advocacy. We have a policy team and work with a lobbying firm to convince New York lawmakers to vote on or against legislation that we think is in the best interest of families and young people. This was the work I did in my previous position, so I have a little bit of a soft spot for it. Next is education and training. We have many workshops that we offer for providers, youth, families, and more. These are also part of our conference, which we host every year in Albany. We're also responsible for credentialing professional family and youth peer advocates in the state. More on that in a future episode. I will say, all of our trainings are listed on our website, so please visit if you're interested. I'm even developing a storytelling training that we plan on giving in late 2025, so stay tuned for that. Lastly, we seek to educate the public. Your average New Yorker isn't expected to have a working understanding of the bureaucracy and inner machinations of the mental health system, for instance, so that's where we come in. We get that information together so you don't have to. That's part of my job and why they let me make silly TikToks that contain secret nuggets of actually important information, kind of like sneaking my dog a pill in a piece of deli cheddar. I can explain this until I am blue in the face, which I basically already have, but even I get tired of hearing myself talk sometimes. When facing the challenge of introducing ourselves, I brainstormed about who else could talk about families together. My first ever guest is someone I've known nearly 1/3 of my life, is responsible for my career, and literally signs my paychecks. She's been here at Families Together since the beginning, is currently the CEO, and has the best bird's eye view of all of the important work that we do here. Please welcome Paige Pierce. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today, Paige. My first question is very important, very relevant to the work here we do at Families Together in New York State. Can I have a race?
Absolutely.
Oh, that's good. Oh,
Well-
so I have you
well
on the
done.
I have you on the record now. Excellent.
You have me on the record. You're being recorded.
Signed, sealed, delivered. We can talk about the details for that offline. But seems kind of like a silly question considering we've known each other for, oh my God, nearly 10 years at this point, right? I want to say.
Yeah.
Wow,
Crazy.
that's crazy. Who are you and what do you do here at Families Together in New York State?
My name is Paige Pierce. I'm the CEO at Families Together. I've been here for 26 plus years. At the time that I started, we were a small organization out of our 2-room office in Troy, New York.
This kind of gets into a question I'm going to ask later, but you kind of described, your start here at Families Together, like 2 people, 2-room office. What is our rough size and scope of work now here in 2025 when this is being recorded?
We have 42 full-time staff, and we're statewide. Of course, we have staff in every corner of the state. And
kind of broadly as possible, pretend someone's on the street and they're not too familiar with the mental health world and us in particular. What is Families Together in New York State in your own words?
We have multiple roles. Our primary role is to serve as a voice, a unified voice for families and young people across New York State who are involved in multiple systems, primarily behavioral health, but also other systems we're involved in all the time, in part because of our involvement with behavioral health. Being that voice takes on multiple roles. The infrastructure of family peer support in New York State, meaning the family peer advocates and youth peer advocates, is something that Families Together has been involved in from the very beginning, helping to create the training and then the credential to become a family peer advocate or a youth peer advocate. And there's lots more information about that on our website, but the workforce part of our role is to strengthen the ability for peer support to be a functioning system within the state, so that no family or young person needs to go alone. They can have access to peer support. And we know that peer support works. We know that having peers helping you navigate a system that you are unfamiliar with, we walk in as a peer with trust and credibility that no number of letters after someone's name can buy. There's a huge part of who Families Together is, like I said, the voice for families and young people. Our motto is nothing about us without us. meaning that because of our lived experience, we have some expertise that can help policymakers make decisions that are going to impact our families and our young people. If they listen to us, they'll have better outcomes. And if they don't listen to us, we will make ourselves heard.
Mhm.
We spend a lot of time advocating and empowering young people and family members to have that voice for themselves, to share their particular stories, which is why your role exists, to be able to help with storytelling in a compelling way so that our stories can help influence policymaking, can help influence public opinion, and ultimately being empowered as an individual and as a family member or a young person, being empowered and feeling as if your story matters. The network of peer support programs out there and the families and young people that are part of that, it's our job to help connect them and to help strengthen that and to support those programs so that they can continue to thrive at the local level. We don't work at the local level and we don't do direct service, but what we do is support those people in ways like helping make sure policies that are passed in Albany or at state agencies that are going to impact their programs are passed in a way that includes them and includes their perspective, and making sure that they're fundable, making sure that they have the ability to sustain themselves, so that those local programs can continue.
That is both really awesome, and a lot of what you just said is why I've kind of been struggling to put together this first episode. So, Brad Hansen, our public policy director, once described us as a big tent organization, which I think you would probably agree with that description. It's kind of like you try to work specifically on mental health and behavioral health, right? The problem is when you start trying to advocate in that space, it immediately bleeds into so many other topic areas because of the cross systems nature of it involved, right? Like I can even just speaking from my own personal experience, like I've experienced in both the mental health system in New York State and the developmental disability side. And oftentimes people think of those things as completely separate entities when a lot of the time they are deeply, deeply intertwined. Like siloing these things is both inaccurate and unhelpful a lot. But it also presents a challenge trying to do a broad overview of the work that we do because we kind of just have like so many plates spinning in the air. It feels like from a like topic and policy point of view.
Absolutely, absolutely. We've been saying for years that family members often joke that we have to be the care managers for all our care managers from the multiple systems that our kids are involved in. And sometimes those different systems don't know what the other one is doing, don't even know that they are both working with the same family. That's not only wasteful, but frustrating and can cause a lot of angst for family members and frustration even for the systems folks who feel as if the family isn't complying with them, but they might be trying to comply with the other people that they met with yesterday. There is a lot of frustration also at the state level about the siloing of funding, the siloing of policies. One state agency that has a policy about restraint that is completely opposite of what another state agency has, their policy about restraint in a residential facility, for instance. And some of those facilities are licensed under both those state agencies. So what are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to know which kid is on the playground? They're in an argument, and which one falls under this rule, and which one falls under this policy? Those are the kinds of the frustrations that happen when there's bureaucracy is involved, and they aren't as effective as they could be. And as a whole, as a system, the system is less effective if they can't collaborate, coordinate, communicate. And often, what happens too when it comes to funding is that one system might feel, and this happens a lot at the county level, one system might feel like that kid has a X diagnosis and therefore we don't pay for that they pay for that over that other building. And the problem with that is that it doesn't matter who pays. It's what does the child need, what does the family need, and how can we make it work. And unfortunately, when there's territories or there's funding, those silos can get stronger instead of being able to blend.
Yeah, well, probably later episode, I plan on doing a more deep dive in our specific like policy and advocacy work. A lot of the agencies we're talking about, the work that we do is within New York State, and a lot of these offices, such as the Office of OMH or OPWDD, which stands for Office of Persons with Developmental Disabilities. These places are under the purview of New York State, specifically the executive branch. So under the purview of the governor, which is, as of this recording, Governor Kathy Hochul. Yeah, it's a little frustrating and sometimes difficult to understand why these agencies, which ostensibly, even though they work on different topics, work with oftentimes the same clientele within the state and are under the same bureaucratic purview, often, yeah, like you said, have just
Yeah.
completely differing, oftentimes maybe even wildly differing policies for how to handle certain things. And some of them will be like, oh, you have a developmental disabilities diagnosis, that we're washing our hands of you, that's not our jurisdiction. Which, again,
Right.
I'm only speaking for myself, but funny enough, my mental health
Hmm.
conditions don't just disappear when people figure out that I also have an autism diagnosis. They don't just conveniently go away. I wish they would.
Yeah.
That would make my life simple, but they just don't. So
I think
it's
that's what they're looking for. Is the systems want simplicity. It does. We are complex human beings. We are complex creatures. I often joke. My son is also on the autism spectrum, and I say he's a man without a country. OPWDD didn't think he qualified for their services because wasn't intellectually disabled. OMH didn't see him because he had a developmental disability diagnosis. He didn't qualify under them. So, and then when he turned 21, the school system was done. So he really was a man without a country.
that is actually a brilliant segue into one of my other questions. We've been talking a lot about the work that Families Together does. So, as much as you're comfortable sharing, what is your personal story as a parent, as someone who has navigated these systems that led you to the work that you do and it led you to Families Together in New York State specifically?
My son Emmett, who is my second child, was diagnosed at the age of 3 years and 3 months with autism. And at the time, it was before the internet, actually. So I couldn't even Google it. Went to the library and went to the library cards and looked up autism and found 2 fiction books about autism and milk allergies and that kind of thing. And spent a lot of time just going through the process of understanding, not only making it my business to know about the diagnosis and what Emmett was going to need, but also to find out like what are the services that are out there and how can I make sure that he gets everything he needs to be the healthiest and happiest that he can be. And what I was met with time and time and time again was multiple systems who had absolutely no interest in Emmett McDonald or in what does my family need, or even just being helpful. It felt like there were roadblocks everywhere, and I was having to fight, literally sometimes in a hearing, about whether or not he needed occupational therapy and whether he needed speech therapy, and doing as much reading as I could do. But what astounded me the most was how unfamily friendly all of the systems were. At a time when I felt like we needed support the most, we got not only no support, but a lot of roadblocks. I did feel empowered by talking to other parents. I had a group of parents that would meet for coffee on every second Tuesday and share stories. Sometimes we laughed, sometimes we cried, but it was peer support, essentially. It wasn't paid, it wasn't through a system, but it was informal, and I found it to be extremely empowering, sometimes just therapeutic. So we moved to Albany area in 1999, and I met a woman at a dinner party who was served on the board for this organization called Families Together in New York State. And I was telling her about my history, and I had worked at the time, I'd been working at the Mental Health Association in Tennessee, TennCare Partners Program, behavioral health in TennCare. And so we talked a lot about that. And in the newspaper, because again, before the internet, there was an ad for executive director of Families Together in New York State. And I applied. Actually, it was for director of public policy at the time. And I applied and called this woman, and she called the rest of the board and said, we need to hire her. And so that was the beginning in 1999. And the thing that it appealed to me the most was this idea that peer support mattered and that there was public policy work being done around our experience and what could be changed to make it better. So that's how I got involved in it. And that's been really the drive for me all along, has been the idea that our stories matter and that we can be empowered to make change.
It's interesting. I think we've talked about this a few times over the course that we've known each other. Like I am kind of on not the opposite end, but like me and my mom had a very similar experience navigating the systems, and it's unfortunately she passed away a few years ago, but even before then, she never really, I think, discovered peer support in the way that you did, or if she did, it certainly she didn't know that term or didn't have that name. And honestly, this was stuff I didn't know about until I started working here at Families Together. And like a few years in, a lot of stuff started to click, and I was like, wow, my life could have been so much easier if if we had known about even like half of this stuff, like me navigating special education courses, just all that sort of thing, with my mom having to like I've described this to you before. My mother was a very mama bear like personality. Like if she felt like I was being
Mhm.
treated unfairly and messed with, God help the person on the other end of that. And I feel like she wouldn't have needed to advocate so fiercely and so harshly, so exhaustingly a lot of the times, if she had like a lot of these like supports in place. And I mean, like, you did have a lot of those stuff, and it's still difficult, right? Like it just goes to show like how just important a lot of this work and just like peer support and feeling heard by people who have gone through similar experience to you, that just how important and like sometimes life changing that is.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, there's that piece for, the people themselves, the parents and the young person. And then there's the part about the systems needing to understand. And that's where our stories come in, really. Because what I noticed a lot was, like you just said, I did have the privilege of having access to support. I had a job that was flexible enough that when the school called and said, come pick them up, I could do that. But I was very empathetic to the parents who, maybe a single mom who's working at an hourly job, that cannot take phone calls at work and
My
certainly
mom
can't
was a
leave
single
work.
mom and worked at Pizza Hut for 25 years. She was put in a position where oftentimes she would have to choose between dealing with whatever was going on with me or my brother and our economic security, which is
Yes,
quite frankly an unjust way for a system to be lied
absolutely.
out.
Extremely unjust. That's a perfect word, Zach. And honestly, not only making the choice, but maybe making the choice between keeping the job. And then where are we as a family if we lose the job and can't keep the apartment and can't keep, so that's where all those other systems really come into play, including the child welfare system and sometimes the juvenile justice system, and there are multi stressors in our families' lives. The thing that is probably the most stressful is the systems and the lack of like empathy and just user friendliness of our multiple systems that are not coordinated, not really a system at all.
There are individuals within these systems who are like fantastic and do amazing work, and like we love our like direct care providers, for example. I would say, like, just going off what you just said, like sometimes these systems that they work within can erode that over time, and just like at the end of the day, they're people who need to get their jobs done too, and sometimes I feel like empathy is not necessarily incentivized all the time, which is sad, quite frankly.
And we see that a lot, in general, in our current government, and the lack of empathy. What can happen is that people become not human. When we take away that human aspect of anyone, we're doing everybody disservice. But like, who are we if we're not human? My goodness,
Yeah.
you know.
There's bureaucracy tends to lend itself, like there's a degree of some people in certain positions of power. At a certain point, it just boils down to numbers on a spreadsheet. I mean, we've been talking a few
Mhm.
times during this conversation about the importance of storytelling. Like, data is great, like figures are great, math is good because we can back up what we're saying. But humans, I've always said this, humans are narrative creatures and they are compelled by story. So sharing our firsthand experience of how these systems have been, let's be kind and say subpar at times, I think
Mhm.
really is a big motivator for actually changing them.
one of the things that you had asked me earlier, or you had mentioned that you were going to ask, is about, what's the difference between where we were when I started in 1999 versus where we are in 2025. And beyond just as an organization where we are, there's where are we as a state and where are we as a movement? And that's the biggest thing that's different. I was at a juvenile justice youth summit a couple of weeks ago, and the focus was on the youth voice. The speakers were young people who had lived experience in the juvenile justice system. And this is not a system that was familiar with Nothing About Us Without Us before, until recently. And I'd like to say that we had some part in that, because we have a lot of families who have involvement in young people who got involvement in the juvenile justice system. We were very active in the Raise the Age campaign for that very reason. Our young people were being, at disproportionate amounts, being treated like adults in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, just
sometimes
some quick context for anyone listening. Raise the Age was a bill that we advocated for, and did it get passed in 2017?
Yes.
Right.
And took effect in October 2018.
We were one of the last states in the United States where you could try, in some cases, 16 and 17-year-olds as an adult, which, again, I have an entire episode dedicated to policy stuff coming in the future, and we'll probably get even more narrow than that, because that's its own huge thing to talk about, and I want to make sure it deserves its own attention. But that's just an example, I would say, of one of our highest profile major legislative wins that kind of objectively improves the lives of many young people in the who have had brushes with the juvenile justice system here in the state.
Yeah. And the thing that really impressed me about that event a few weeks ago was how far we've come as a state and as a movement about including stakeholder input and recognizing the value of youth voice and family voice. The Office of Mental Health and the mental health system really does deserve a lot of credit for having paved that trail with us. We've injected that same kind of Nothing About Us Without Us theory into other systems, including OPWDD, the addiction world, special education and education in general, child welfare, which is also not an easy system to include youth and family voice in, particularly family voice, where they didn't necessarily see families as part of the solution. But they've come a long way, and it's really wonderful to see the evolution of the importance, recognizing the importance of stakeholder input, and particularly people who are marginalized in so many different ways, taking our input and putting it to policy and including our voice in summits about where the direction that agency is going to go. It's really great.
I remember a few years ago, I was my previous position before this one, I was the youth public policy coordinator. So I was working directly in our policy department. We oftentimes have disagreements about the specifics that end up in either the budget or in bills that are passed in New York State. And again, that's something we will probably get into the weeds a little bit more when I talk to Brad for an episode of one of these. I remember you said that a few years ago, the children's mental health was mentioned in a State of the State speech for
it wasn't.
The first time ever.
It
was something along those lines.
In 2000, we had a group, the Children's Mental Health Action Network, and one of our goals was to get the governor to say the word children or families in his State of the State. And that was in 2000. Recently, not only was she mentioning children and families, but children's behavioral health and families, throughout her State of the State. We couldn't get the governor before that to say, not before that, but many years ago, to even say the words family or children. So we have come a long way in terms of being in the spotlight. And back in those days, back in 2000 to 2006 or whatever it was, that we were working on Timothy's Law, which was an insurance parity bill to have behavioral health coverage in private insurance be on par with physical health and not have arbitrary different copays and different limits of visits per year, that kind of thing. That was a huge win for us as well. And it took many, many years. And it took the voice and the story of Timothy O'Clair's family. And that made a big difference in getting that law passed. And it has, again, made a huge difference for thousands and thousands of families across New York State for the past 20 years.
Just for quick context, if anyone has not heard of that story, could you just do like a brief overview of how that story and how it led to Timothy's Law?
Yes. So, we had been working on an insurance parity bill for a few years, and we're having trouble getting lawmakers to understand the plight. And there was a lot of stigma around what is, mental health, what is addiction services, why should we cover those? They aren't, those are character flaws, not, health issues. So just the education alone on that and the breaking down the stigma barriers was huge. Being able to personalize it and use a story to be able to illustrate the issue. We met the O'Clair family, who had lost their son Timothy at the age of 12 to suicide after months and years of struggling to access behavioral health services. Dad worked for the state, had good health insurance, what was considered good at the time, with 30-day limits on inpatient per year. Well, that lasted for the first 20 weeks of the year, and then he was out. And they had done everything. They had relinquished custody at one point for residential treatment. They struggled a lot. We worked with that family to create Timothy's Law, to have Timothy's namesake be the namesake of the bill that would create insurance parity for behavioral health in New York State. A lot of learning for us as family members who had this lived experience. We had stories to tell, but how were these stories going to impact policy? How were we going to use our experiences to shape policy? My
friends and family who don't necessarily work in this field will ask, aside from like me explaining maybe like my day to day, like what a lot of like what our goals is, because again, we're kind of broad and we work with a lot of different topics. I would say if you want a summation, we're working to make it so that we live in a state where a young person can get services when they need them, and we don't have to be in a situation which results in the tragic early death of a young person, or anyone for that matter, but yeah, especially a young person. Perfect picture, like what are some of our like end goals as an organization? I would say that's probably among them, where a young person doesn't really have to go through stuff like that, and it definitely doesn't end in the way that it did for him.
And talk about peer support. One of the things that Tom and Donna O'Clair got from the whole experience was a lot of empowerment and a lot of support. We wrapped around that family to make sure that they knew that they weren't being exploited, they were being supported, and they wanted to see some change come out of their lived experience.
Yeah, agreed. So we've talked a lot. One of the last things I want to discuss, we've talked a lot about our legislative work, which again, we're going to probably delve deeper into later in the future. So that's our lobbying efforts, trying to convince lawmakers to pass certain laws, get certain stuff included in the New York State budget every year. A lot of what we do also is awareness and advocacy, though. And those two things are obviously heavily interconnected, but we're also talking about educating the general public on a lot of what we do and a lot of these certain topics, because I think you were alluding to it earlier, where sometimes just the average person in New York State doesn't necessarily know. We don't expect everyone to like, for example, know the ins and outs of the juvenile justice system, and I don't know the polling or anything like this, and this isn't a question I had written down, so feel free to correct me on any of this, but let's use raise the age as an example. Did the average New Yorker, you think, know that you could try a 16 or 17-year-old as an adult in our state? Because my guess is no.
Not only the average New Yorker didn't know, the legislators didn't know. When we would go and meet with them, explain, they would say, no, that can't be right. And we're like, it is. Look it up right here, and they didn't know. What was helpful was to be able to explain to them that we're not just talking about some other kids in some other state and some other community. We're talking about your child as well. If they get arrested for any small thing at the age of 16 or 17, they are treated upon arrest as an adult. So That means that they don't have to call the parent. The police do not have to call the parents, and they often don't, or they often didn't. And they were immediately into an adult criminal justice system, no matter the crime. And that included, everything from the way they were treated upon arrest to how things went with probation later on, or any kind of aftercare. Yeah, the average person definitely didn't know it. Legislators didn't know it. And even when we explained it, often we had to prove it and show exact cases. And again, telling stories of young people whose lives were impacted significantly being treated as an adult at the age of 16 or 17. And we did have some stories too that were success stories where, a young man who was 15 when he was arrested, his buddy was 16, and they went in entirely different ways because of a few months difference in their birthdays. But success story meaning that he didn't end up at Rikers Island, and he is now, got his master's degree and a young family. And that's the kind of stuff that those kinds of stories, whether positive or tragic, can help influence policy.
Yeah, but raise the age is a great example of what I'm talking about here and what you just described. Because again, lawmakers are beholden to their constituents. So, and I mean, in the case of the assembly, it's every 2 years that they're going through elections. So a lot of the work that we do is not just educating lawmakers, but also educating the general public. Like, I'm often reminded, again, I'm a little bit biased because I was recently part of the policy team here, but in the recent past, like, raise the age is something we had to defend a little bit because of, let's call it preconceived notions, biases, and maybe even just like misinformation going around about crime statistics and stuff like that in the state. Yeah. Misinformation about crime and how it's prosecuted and who's doing it can lead to people having sometimes statistically wrong information. And when they have that information, they sometimes vote based on that information. So my point being, a lot of the work that we do is trying to make sure that people have the correct information when it comes to the families and young people that we're working with and the truth behind what they dealing with all these systems.
That's so important. Yeah, because the media often sensationalizes stuff or picks out the sensationalized stories that make the headlines, and it will be, statistically 1 in 1,000, but it's the one that hits the news. So the public has an opinion based on that, and then they vote for their legislators based on what they saw on the news, and they don't necessarily know about the thousands and thousands that were benefited from raise the age or any other, law that they pass.
This was an amazing conversation. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. I guess just before we sign off, and a lot of the future episodes are going into specific topics, what would you want anyone listening, the average New Yorker listening, maybe who hasn't heard of us, or maybe even some people who have heard of us a little bit, what would you like them to leave with going forward about us and our work here at Families Together?
I would say if you're a parent or a young person who's had involvement in these systems that we just talked about, there is an organization in Albany that is statewide, but we are here in Albany fighting for you, fighting for your rights, fighting for your voice to be heard. And then at the local level, there are peer support programs specifically out there to support you, to strengthen the network. And we want to hear your voice here in Albany as well, so that we can carry those stories to make differences. A core group of staff and board members at Families Together who wake up every day saying, what can I do for families and young people in the state today? We will always listen. We're here to learn and then to educate.
Thank you so much, Paige. My name is Zack, and this was the Peercast. Thank you for listening. If you like the show, give us a like or review on the podcast platform of your choice. Really helps us out. Maybe even share and tag us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or TikTok. If you're curious about anything we discussed in this episode or would like more information, feel free to reach out to me, Zack Kilmer, at zkilmer@ftnys.org, or my phone number, 518-708-3808. Visit our website at ftnys.org to check out our upcoming events and trainings. Families Together in New York State is a 501c3 nonprofit registered in the state of New York. Not all of the opinions shared in this program necessarily reflect the exact policy or general stances of Families Together. For any questions about us or the work that we do, please email info@ftnys.org.